Welcome to another episode of the Hosea 4 verse 6 podcast. I have an exceptional guest with me. She has a PhD from Yale University. She is the author of Rural Radicals, Righteous Rage in the American Grain. She is also the author of Main Street in Crisis, the Great Depression and the Old Middle Class on the Northern Plains. Plus, the Introduction to Dakota Territory, 1861 to 1889, a study of the frontier politics. She has many awards, part of numerous associations. Thank you for being on the show, Dr. Catherine Stock.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
I just got this clap feature, so I'm trying to use it.
I like it. Hey, you can use the clap feature again because the only award I've ever won that I cared about was the one for teaching excellence at my college. So nice. That's the one I just like every year I'd be like, oh, I hope I get that.
No, that's clapping. Let's clap for that.
Good. Thank you.
Teaching excellence is very important.
Yeah.
So I saw that you got a PhD from Yale.
I did. It's amazing.
Yeah. It's a lot of work to get a PhD from Yale.
Yeah.
Every time I see a PhD, I see a long time.
Yeah.
What made you want to study history for that long and at a prestigious college?
Okay, so I didn't want to go to Yale. I was really afraid to go to Yale when I was an undergraduate. It was a long way from home. I grew up in Minnesota.
Wow.
And it had only taken women at Yale for about 6 or 7 years when I first went there. But I felt, I was also only 17, long story. I felt that refusing to go to a school that so many women had fought so long to gain admission to would be like an anti-feminist thing to do. So I sort of packed my bag and dragged it across the New Haven Green and ended up there as an undergraduate where I was homesick and there were a lot of things about it that were very hard, not welcoming. When people talk about campus communities need to be welcoming, I'm right there. Not at all welcoming of women, young women. And then I went to my first introduction to the history of the American West class, and I was finally like, oh my gosh, I know this stuff. I'm from Minnesota. I know the Dakotas. I know Nebraska. I know California. I was hearing words that felt more like home to me, and I basically just followed that path all the way through graduate school. But I should also say that at the same time I was also playing a varsity sport, and that was way more important to me than my schoolwork for a long time. I played soccer at Yale for the first 4 years that there ever was a women's team. So that was something that we knew at the time was important to do, and we were so mocked for how badly we played, and no one had a sense of the long historical trajectory. Were we good soccer players? I mean, what do you mean by good? We were the best in the United States because there were so few women who were playing, girls and women who were playing. But anyway, so one of my favorite stories is that there was this just really big, important guy who was teaching the required seminar in American Studies, which was my major, and his class kind of conflicted with my soccer practice. So I would go to class in my workout clothes with my bag, and it never crossed my mind that it was rude for me to leave class a half an hour, 15 minutes early, so that I could only be 15 minutes late to practice.
Yeah.
And then when I got into graduate school a couple years later, he saw me and he was like, I saw that you got into graduate school.
Wow.
And he goes, I was on leave the year they made those choices. So I started graduate school also feeling like maybe I didn't belong, right? And like maybe people weren't that welcoming. But I found my group of friends. I had the most wonderful peers, all of whom have just written the most wonderful books, and that I just love knowing that they were my friends in graduate school. So that's what helped me get through it.
That's great. You mentioned the woman before you was one of the reasons why you made that journey from Minnesota to Connecticut.
Yeah.
What significance did the women in the past play in that decision? Did you just really weigh their sacrifice very heavily?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up. My mom was the principal, the head of school at an all girls school that then merged with a boys school, and she was chosen to be the head of the combined merged school. And the boys actually had a march against her because they thought no woman. This is like 1974. No woman should be the head of a school that had boys in it. My my English teacher actually had taught Al Franken and Tom Davis, who were creating Saturday Night Live at the time, and they came to my English class and they wanted to show what Saturday Night Live was going to be, so they put on an improvisational skit making fun of the fact that there was this woman who thought she could be a head of school. So the feminist politics that I'm talking about were like very much lived in my household, and I knew what it took for women to stand their ground. I knew what it took because I saw it every day. And I didn't want to go to Yale. I sat in the middle of cross campus and just cried and cried. I didn't want to go there, but I knew that I needed to do what they had, that it had taken such a long time for women to be able to do.
Yeah.
And then I needed to work to make it a better place.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
that's the important part, right? You want
that's
to make
the
a
important
difference.
part. That is the important part.
Yeah. Why is studying history important based off what you studied at Yale?
Well, I mean, I love to study history, but I really like to teach it even more. And I think those two things for me are connected, like why I love to teach it and why I like to study it. Those things are mostly connected. And I was thinking about this question, and I have a variety of different answers. I really like to think about how we got where we are. Like there's always a before, right? I always tell my students to ask, since when? Since when has it been like this? Why? Since when? It's like it's a simple question, but always like super complicated answer. Yeah. And since when is never like 2016. Yeah. Unless it's a really specific 2016 question, right? It's right. We could talk about the history of the United States by going back to the Reformation, right? I teach generally the 20th century and the 21st century. Yeah. So I try to, students, like, if I say, like, we're starting with the New Deal, they get like, oh my gosh, the pain. And I'm like, oh no, we are starting with the New Deal, and you're not just going to memorize the AAA and the CWA and the PWA and the blah, blah, blah. We're going to talk about why this was such a radical program and what we're still arguing about that was innovated by the Roosevelt administration, right? So, okay, so that's one answer, and almost everything that I have written has been inspired by today. Like, how can I understand the politics of today? And we can talk a little bit more about that later if you want. But I was also thinking about how teaching history and also studying history and reading history is another way in which we can engage our imaginations and our sort of humanistic imaginations, right? And I remember when I took my 3 kids to Gettysburg. This is when I really understood this. I have 3 kids, and they had 3 different reactions to being at Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is a sacred place. Yeah. But there's not really anything to see.
Yeah.
right? It's monuments, right? And, it's not entertainment, right? Like kids like to go to Hershey Park, which isn't very far, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so my oldest was just a good student, and he was like, yep, yes, yes, when's lunch?
Yeah.
And my daughter wanted none of it. She was just
Uh,
like, but what she said is really important. She said,
mhm.
"This is an empty place.
Yeah.
What are we even looking at?"
Mm.
But my youngest insisted that we go to the gift shop, get him a like Connecticut militia hat
Yeah.
and one of the rifles, and
Uh,
take his picture in all the different places. He wanted a picture of himself in the Devil's Den, and he wanted a picture of himself and where Pickett's charge was, because he was there.
yeah.
It was real. It was real to him right in that moment. It still gives me chills. And I was like, that is the best way to think about the past, is to actually try to imagine what was that like in all of its often horrors, right? And also not to assume what part you would play.
Yeah.
I often have students from the Boston area when I teach the American Revolution, which is rarely,
Yeah.
because I usually do the 20th and 21st centuries. I always ask them, okay, so which side were you going to be on, right? Were you going to be a American revolutionary, a rebel, or are you going to be more conservative and just say like, oh, come on, like these things aren't so bad, like the king is a good guy, blah, blah. Of course they all say, oh, well, I would have been a revolutionary. I'm like, oh, really? Like, are you a revolutionary in your life right now?
Yeah.
Are you risking your life right now for something that you believe in, or are you playing it safe? And I was like, you don't really know. And a lot of those, you sign the Declaration of Independence, you're signing your own death warrant. So don't be so sure, right? Don't take for granted the things that the courage that people had to have to do all kinds of things. And, and I'm rarely interested in the famous people, but like
Right.
the ordinary people,
People, yep.
right? The ordinary people of all kinds who did things that were incredibly brave. And that we might not, maybe we would do those things, maybe we wouldn't, right? So, right? So I mean, that's, yeah. I just think that history is a fabulous way of understanding the present, but also understanding human beings, their differences, their similarities, their experiences. We all, I mean, right? Like on some levels, right, just as humans, we're all the same, and yet our differences also define us and make it challenging to understand the past.
Absolutely. I think when you brought up that conversation about understanding abstract in a concrete environment
Yeah.
is to really put yourself in a psychological aspect of
Yep.
the individuals living during that time.
Yep.
Because, like, how many people are going to enlist in a war where you could get shot and the fear is real?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Or get stabbed, or, what I mean? Or go
Oh,
through that
yeah.
hardship just to get a concept of freedom that you don't even know how it's going to look like after. Nobody knows how America's going to look like after they defeat
Right.
Great Britain or after the Civil War. But
Right.
they're fighting for this abstract idea
Yeah.
with these concrete bodies, and their life is on the line, and their
Right.
possibilities are on the line for possibilities that they never seen before, which is
Right.
the
Right.
the greatest thing that I've like when every time
Right.
I conceptualize history, I think that's the greatest
Right.
thing.
Yeah, I was just talking to a friend, and then I was also reading about President Biden's visit to Normandy, and I've never been there, but people say like it is overwhelming to go to the cemetery and see all these gravestones of people who had the courage to storm those beaches, knowing, especially if they were in the first waves, that they were probably going to die, and believing it was worth it, and and never never, basically never getting to grow up, right?
Yeah.
They never got to grow up, and there's a really controversial piece that I often teach, because I again, like a lot of my students are liberal leaning, and they, I want to complicate the way they think, even if they come back out having the same point of view. So there's a wonderful essay called "Thank God for the Atom Bomb" by a guy who was a really well-known historian, Paul Fussell, who was an 18-year-old private on among the troops that were going to were practicing to land on the Japanese beaches.
Yeah.
And he said that when they heard that the atom bomb had been dropped, they all started to cry, because they realized they were going to get to grow up after all.
Wow.
Those are his words. And it's still like, they get to grow up after all. They knew they were going to die. And that may not be the right way to debate whether atomic weapons were good or bad, but that was one individual human being's experience, right? That for him it was life or death, and he knew it. So I don't know. I just, I'm very passionate about trying to get that historical imagination to work for you.
Yeah. No,
Right.
I try to do that too in my classroom, because I feel like it's so it puts in perspective today.
Oh, yeah.
Just like what you said before about why studying history is important, is because just to get a flat screen TV, they might have had to drop that atomic bomb.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We don't know what different outcomes
Yeah.
might have occurred if we didn't. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
No, we
it's
can't know. I mean, and you can imagine, right?
yeah.
How much debate and literature there is about that. And I think that was part of the point of the Oppenheimer film, was to bring back to us again the complexity of what science and what happens when you try to put science and ethics and the imperatives of war in the same space.
Yep.
You end up with a 3-hour movie, but
Yeah, it's a long movie.
oh, and that, by the way, you and I have never talked about this before, and
Yeah.
we can come back to it later. One of my favorite courses that I teach is about American history on film,
Yeah.
and what I try to get across to my students, it's the only course I teach where there's only one point. We just practice that point over and over again. That
Yeah.
a film, the way the past is depicted in a film
Yeah.
tells you more about the time when it was made than the time it's representing, right? So
I get what you're saying. Yeah.
right, so Oppenheimer is about our moment right now. It's just using the past as a landscape, or a tabula rasa, if you will, for it working out the issues. I had a student who told me how the themes, this I still don't get, but this is what I love when students like make my head blow off. The themes in Oppenheimer and the themes in Barbie are the same. And I was like, I don't know. Something about chaos, and we don't know the answers, and I can't remember, because I was just like, I didn't even know what to say, but she sounded really smart when she was saying it.
Yeah. Now, I mean, the thing I like about history is not only that it echoes, but it kind of like, and it echoes because the human conditions stay the same,
Yep.
because our need, it revolves around our needs and the things that we want and things that we desire. What brought you to rural America? Is it because you're from Minnesota?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Minneapolis, which is a big city, but my grandparents were from North Dakota.
Okay.
And I remember, when we were growing up, we would go out and visit relatives out there. I spent quite a bit of time in both North and South Dakota. And when I was coming up with my dissertation topic, which became my first book, Main Street in Crisis, I was trying to understand why my grandfather and my grandmother would argue about Franklin Roosevelt. Like, now, again, we're in the 70s, and they had a profound disagreement about Franklin Roosevelt. And like Thanksgiving dinners, couldn't be complete unless we touched on.
Yeah.
So I remember that, and I
Mhm.
remember being really confused by that.
Yeah.
Right? What was confusing to me, because I think at that time in the 70s, the early 70s, before the Reagan Revolution, I think people were still just accepting that the government had a role to play in helping people, right?
Mm.
In all kinds of different ways.
Yeah.
I had done work at a Head Start nursery school. So what surprised me was not that my grandmother felt that so many of their friends who were farmers had had their farms saved by the New Deal. Um, but but my grandfather, like, oh my God, he like literally thought that Franklin Roosevelt was a communist. And I didn't
Mm.
understand what that meant. And I
Yeah.
didn't understand how, like, this, of course, I understand this better now, but
Mm.
I didn't understand how two people with such similar backgrounds could have such different views about politics, and also why those politics still mattered to them so much in the 1970s, right?
Yeah.
It still mattered. It was so relevant. It was so real to them.
Yeah.
My father told me, my father was born in 1931. And he told me that on Sundays after church, his grandfather was a Methodist minister, and they lived in Michigan. He said every Sunday after church, they would take a drive in the car. Like, that's such a, I don't know if it's a rural thing or just a Midwestern thing, but this is the Michigan side of my family, not the North Dakota side of my family. So
Gotcha.
he said they would go up to Ypsilanti and bring supper to two unmarried aunts, two elderly maiden aunts. And all these maiden aunts who were like in their 80s, so it's 1940 and they're in their 80s, they wanted to debate Reconstruction and
Wow.
whether it had worked out or not worked out.
Mm.
And I'm like, what? Like,
Mm.
my
Yeah.
father as a little boy used to
Yeah.
sit and listen to people having arguments about things that happened what seems like a really long time ago, but
Mm.
not. It's not. It's not. It's not.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I'm not sure I answered your question, but
So your interest in rural America is due to
yeah,
just your interaction with your family members and their
yes,
experience with
yes,
their
yes.
conditions during their time.
And also that I discovered when I came to Yale how little there's a lot of the history of the American West is well told and has been for a long time, like especially like the California Gold Rush or the Oregon Trail, right? But I didn't really see much that represented the Northern Plains, and I've really done a lot of writing about that part of the world. So because that's where they're from, and as it turned out, there's really not very much written about the Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota, not very much at all.
Yeah, I mean, looking back at my history career, like I've barely heard any. Only thing you hear about
Right.
the plains is cowboys,
Yeah.
Indians,
Yeah.
war between them,
Yeah.
people moving to California for the Great Deal. This
Yeah.
guy, that
Yeah. Yeah.
capitalism. You hear all
Rust
about
Bowl.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, I think if anyone knows anything about the Great Plains, it's like Little House on the Prairie, like
Yeah.
Laura Ingalls Wilder, and that's the representation. You know, um, even the movie Fargo is actually shot in Minnesota, not in
Yeah.
North Dakota. It just has a weird. It just is called that, which is totally bizarre.
Yeah.
And um, and of course, what were used to be called the Indian Wars, right? Those are like the Battle of Little Bighorn is in that part of the world, right? The massacre at Wounded Knee, a lot of native radicalism in the 1960s, the Red Power movement came out of that region too. So, yeah, there isn't very much out there. I didn't want to be the 100 millionth person to write about, George Washington or something like that. I wanted to really have a fresh, open. It allowed me to be creative, one of the things that I like to do in my writing is to take small things and to unpack them into like their larger meanings and their larger connections. So it allowed me to do that. It has allowed me to do that. Right. But that's what it is. That's what it was for me, is a personal connection, but that wasn't my lived reality, right? I did not grow up in a small town in the Dakotas. I grew up in a big urban, academically, oriented, diverse city. And so sometimes that helped me when I was doing my research, and sometimes it definitely worked against me.
Yeah. How did you remove your bias being rural to being from an urban centered place to then now a rural centered place?
Well, I think it helped that I knew so many people, and my grandparents had introduced me to so many people. Yeah. My grandfather ran like a wholesale grocery business, and it had a lot of like warehouses in different towns. So sometimes when I went to those towns, I would introduce myself as his granddaughter, and then just to try, I wasn't doing contemporary history at that time. I was doing the 1930s. So I was just trying to listen to people's stories and understand what that experience was like. Yeah. I mean, right? Like, who am I to say what was right or wrong if I'm just listening and trying to maybe I'll have some insights, right? I think that was probably like one of my questions was like, okay, so this economy was imploding, but people did not want the New Deal. They did not want Roosevelt, and they didn't want the New Deal. And even people who knew that Roosevelt was, going to save their farm, they just didn't like it. And I wanted to figure out, like, why is that? Like, why weren't they just like, oh, thanks for this program that's helping me save my farm? And that got me thinking about a lot of these broader things that I'm still thinking about, like the myth of the self-reliant individual, and that I don't need the government to help me, and I'm a pioneer, and all those things that are still definitely part of the mythos of rural America.
Wow. So you're from what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that rural people have this value of they don't want the government to interfere with their lives. They want to be able to do it themselves. Is it because of a fear of a ramification that's going to happen in the future? Because of the government helping them in that time period?
I just think that, like, when your identity is really tied to a sort of an origin story or a myth, then it's not a myth anymore. It's who you are, right? And this idea that the pioneers, this is the craziest thing I've ever written in a book, but since then people have written a lot about it. So Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the whole Little House on the Prairie series, she and her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who was like a co-writer, they were really, really ardent anti-New Deal people. So there is a way to go back to all those children's books and read them as being, because they were written in the 30s. That's why I'm talking about them. They were written in the 30s. So there's a way to go back and read them as being anti-New Deal, like propaganda, like the father in the family, Pa Ingalls would always move whenever there was a government office that was opened on his street and that kind of thing. So if you believe sincerely and profoundly that you made it on your own, right? I don't know if you remember how angry people got when President Obama said, you didn't build this on your own. He said something about, he was making a point about the infrastructure that the federal government pays for. Yeah. Right? Like, if you have a company, you didn't build it on your own. The federal government made the roads. The state government provides the fire service, right? Like, and it made Republicans go batshit. I did so build this on my own. So when you look at the West, and especially the agricultural West, that's
Yeah.
exactly what's going on. They believe to their soul that they've conquered the land on their own with no help from the government, that they're good people who go to church and they don't need any help and they don't need welfare. And all of this also, and I'm sure you can hear this, intersects with their sense of whiteness and race. Like we're not like those other dependent people, right? Meanwhile, it's like super easy to look and see the ways in which the federal government did help them, clear the land, like survey the land, like sell the land, like build the railroads, like. But when people need to believe it, they need to believe it. And what happens in the 30s that's so interesting to me is that it's do or die time. You ever take that check from the New Deal, or your family's not going to have any food to eat.
Yeah.
Right? It's one or the other. And I was interested in the ways that there's a historian, Jim Scott, who talks about everyday resistance, like how ordinary people resist power. And the people in these small towns were accepting the programs of the New Deal, but resisting them at the same time. And I think like that's the kind of thing we all do just to sometimes just survive in the world that we've inherited.
Yeah. No, I mean, I when I look at the value of sticking to your principles and sticking to your morals and standing on what you stand on, I always say that when the conditions change and you still have the values will make you traverse any type of condition.
Yeah, yeah,
But if you're not sticking to your values, and if the condition change from good to bad, you're not going to stick. You're gonna
right.
be everywhere. The conditions are gonna change you as a person.
Yeah.
Do you see that being influenced in their ideology to be more Republican than Democrat?
Right. So that's a great connection, right? So
Yeah.
right, Roosevelt's a Democrat.
Yep.
And there were a lot of farmers who were Democrats at this time, and the split was usually like the farmers were the Democrats and the people who lived in the towns were the Republicans, right? But
Okay.
still, that same sense that becoming dependent on the federal government was wrong, and that the government was wrong, and the government didn't understand us, right? And there's a surprising amount of anti-environmentalism that comes in this early time period in the 1930s, because the New Deal had a lot of conservation programs, right? So anyway, you see the beginnings of a change to a more like almost unitary one-party region with the election of Ronald Reagan. Because Ronald Reagan really, really spoke their language, right? He said the government is never part of the solution, it's part of the problem. And he was a Midwestern guy himself, right? And of course, made a career of playing cowboys and cool macho guys, like independent, self-reliant cowboy people in all his movies. I mean, along with the movies that he made about World War II, where he was also a hero. So that was pretty much the beginnings of a major shift in the political culture, because what most people call the new right, the modern right, the Reagan right, really incorporated that anti-government stuff and some of the conservative social values, which we haven't talked about. But this is a very religious, church-going region, about like 2/3 Protestant, 1/3 Catholic, and that has the increasing number of like conservative Protestant sects. You see, since about 1980. We're not talking about like Presbyterian churches, Methodist churches, Lutheran churches. We're seeing more and more of the sort of evangelical free churches that migrate up from the South. And so now evangelical Protestantism is the primary religious affiliation. So that doubles down right on the, again, with Reaganism, you see the doubling down of social conservatism with anti-government ideas, and some new, some desire to roll back the social changes and social programs and new ideas of the 60s and 70s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, anti-feminism, right? People it's one of the shocking things to see is when George Wallace was running for president as a third-party candidate and a segregationist candidate in 1968, how many votes he got in the South Dakota primary. Really a lot. Yeah, really a lot.
So is the root between the urban and rural divide more educational, environmental, or a balance of both?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question. I do think it is, by environment you mean like the cultural environment?
Yeah, like the plains, the more wide open spaces.
Yeah.
I'm from New York City, so we're on top of each other.
Yeah. I think it's that if I had to choose between the two.
Okay.
Recently, we see that in the Trump Republican Party, we see a big divide between non-college voters and college-educated voters. That's really pretty new, to think that non-college voters would be Republicans. It used to really be the reverse of that. And whenever I say used to be, I mean like before Reagan was elected.
Okay.
So I don't think in the long term it's education as much as it in the long term it is about those honestly, like you did have to be more self-reliant. Like it's true. Like, what are you going to do if you're out in, I tell my students all the time, on I-95 in Connecticut, there's 90 exits, right? If you go from the New York line to the Rhode Island line, there's 90 exits in about 95 miles, or maybe 100 miles. In Wyoming, there's a stretch of highway that's 81 miles with no exits.
Wow.
Okay, so, like, you obviously have to be more prepared to take care of yourself. You obviously are more likely to carry a gun for self-protection from, right? So
a lot of things, yeah.
From a lot of things, right? Like you do, like, right? Like it's one of the most interesting things for me about studying rural America are the times that people really, really, really did have to save themselves, right? And there was no one else for them to rely on but themselves.
Yeah.
And it took till the 1950s and actually it's still not the case. It's still not the case that all rural families have electricity and running water.
Oh, wow.
Right? We know
there's places in America that there's houses that don't have running water and electricity.
Yes. Both in the rural South and also on a lot of Native American reservations. Wow. There still isn't running water. Yeah. So that is right. So it's one of the things that I know that the Biden administration was working for in the infrastructure bill was better internet connection in rural areas, because like how are you gonna compete? How are you gonna educate yourself, right? How are you gonna have access to things in the world we live in if you don't even have internet, right? You don't even have you can't even go to your local library and log onto one of their computers and access there just isn't any. Yeah. So I do think that a lot of the differences come from the real lived experience of, number one, being very much more isolated, but also number two, being without the kind of diversity that you would have experienced in New York City, right? Absolutely. So that's a really big difference, and And I think, right, that there's a really complicated racial history in the North where a lot of people want to say, and especially in the rural North, where people want to say, oh, like, well, it wasn't the South, we weren't racist, we didn't have slaves, blah blah. But right, you know that all these issues are way more complicated than just the laws.
Yeah.
But what was on your house deed? Who were you keeping from buying a house? Who were you chasing out of town? They had these things called sunset laws, like that if you were black or Indian, you couldn't come in, be in town past sunset. So like those kinds of things are woven into the fabric of what people know. Oh, this is how you have to behave, and if you don't behave that way, right, then the police will make sure that you do, one way or the other. So whiteness, the overlay of whiteness with this isolation and with this intensive sense of the importance of rural people to the American past and to American identity, morality, religion, blah blah. It's a very complicated like Venn diagram.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're pointing out is that technology is having a big effect on
Oh yeah.
their mindset too. Like them being rural and not having internet and not having access to the level
Right.
of information that we have in the
Yeah.
city is playing a part in their development and their thinking,
Right.
which is then going to play a part in their politics. So do you think that as technology advances, do you think that these rural areas will start turning blue, or do you think it's just an ideology that's going to pass down through generations because of the religious aspect of it?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, I don't want to make it sound like access to the internet is like this great liberating force because we all know, first of all, that it,
Yeah, it has some issues in it. Yeah.
well, it has a lot of issues, and
Yeah.
if you have certain views, then the algorithms just reinforce those views, and that's all you see, right? But you just see the same things over and over again. I have a student this year who's from a small town in South Dakota where there were 35 students in her high school, including the kids from the farms who had to get bussed in. And one other boy in her class, one young man in her class, decided to go to Columbia. So they were the only two that were going to leave South Dakota for college. And most of the students in her class weren't going to college anyway. They were going to go back and work on the farm. It's fine. But she said that people were horrified that she and this other guy were going to go east to college, that it was like a contamination theory. And she said all her parents ever watch is Fox News. That's all they ever see. That's all they ever know. And if that's all you ever know, so it's not right. So we have to think about media and technology sort of both and, right? That if all you ever see is Fox News and things that are even further to the right than that, and everyone in your community is watching the same thing, right? That's what she said. She said her parents were just crying when she told them that she was going to come east for college, that it was just going to be the most horrible experience. And they called her, they said, like, practically on a nightly basis, asking her if she wanted to come home.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. I was like, wow. No, she was actually like, actually, I'm really glad to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That they're so perturbed by what's going on in the urban centers that they're just crying about it. Wow.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned in the book The Main Street in Crisis. You mentioned that due to the Great Depression, economic hardships reshaped the lives, communities, and identity of this demographic. Over the decades, we have seen like a decline in marriages. We've seen a decline in population in America, and an increased frustration in rural areas.
Yeah.
Is there an argument from rural America that we're not listening to, which has credibility to it?
I mean, that really is such an important, that's like the crux of the matter, isn't it?
Yes.
Like, I can talk about the 1930s all I want, but right now, and for the last 20 years at least,
Yeah.
the problem of rural poverty and the loss of jobs, loss of hospitals, loss of government services, and the rise of the opioid epidemic
Yeah.
has changed that landscape quite a bit. And I think that we make a mistake not taking that very seriously, right? The Republicans seem to have, you can tell by their choice of J.D. Vance that they want to show that they're taking that seriously. Whether they are or not is another question.
Yeah.
But we also make a mistake to say that's all that rural America is anymore. It's just deaths of despair, right? There's a famous book that looked at all of the deaths and why white men in particular have a what's it called, a declining not standard of living, but the age of like how long their lifespan's going to be is starting to decline.
Oh,
right?
wow.
Especially those who are non-college educated and live in rural places, right? So it's, if you look at the demographics of mortality rates, that is going down the fastest. Is non-college educated white men in rural areas, and so and what these sociologists call it are the deaths of despair, deaths from alcoholism, suicide, gun violence, drug overdose. Yeah, and so we make a mistake of saying they're all crazy, they're all drug addicts. Obviously, like, you can't describe communities that way. That's wrong.
Yeah.
But ignoring it as a real lived reality is even more wrong.
Yeah.
Wrong. Can I say wronger?
Yeah.
Right? And I'm interested that the Republicans have gotten that message with more salience, it seems to me, right now, than right. So I don't know if you saw J.D. Vance's acceptance of his vice presidential nomination, but he pointed up into the stands and his mother was there, and he said, "My mother is 10 years clean and sober."
Yeah.
And part of me was like horrified, like, the poor woman, could her addiction history not just be like her own business?
Yeah.
But but it was, it was red meat for everyone in that audience and on television who knew how hard that was, actually, and of any color, right? But especially, right, given where he describes his childhood to have taken place.
Yeah, because I seen a video by J.D. Vance, and he was talking about how he's from the working class.
Yeah.
His mom was definitely an addict.
Yeah.
And he's basically saying he mentioned in his speech that families are being broken
Yeah.
in the rural areas, and
Yes.
that it's being overlooked.
Right.
And if there is a rising issue in rural areas with these despairs, there has to be a root. And
Right.
what
Right.
is the root? Is the
Okay.
root
Oh, yeah.
just, yeah.
I'm so glad we're going there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I just did a review of a book that I hated, but it said something really important. So it's this book called White Rural Rage. And
Okay.
it's on the New York Times bestsellers list, and it's incredibly insulting, paints all white rural people as being like crazy gun nuts, like ready to be mass shooters, like blah, blah, blah. Like,
Yeah.
it's horrible. Like, you can't talk about people that way and make any kind of difference. Honestly, like I said in my review, I just think they were trying to sell books, like create controversy, and that, because like controversy sells.
Absolutely.
So anyway, but they talked about unfettered capitalism, the culture of unfettered capitalism. Now, when I write, I talk about neoliberalism. Some people talk about sort of the politics of Reaganism and Clintonism, right? That basically have allowed big corporations just to eviscerate small towns, where there were all kinds of small general stores and lots of jobs. Now you've got Walmarts and minimum wage jobs, right? And again, like all kinds of like financiers thinking that, oh, the best thing we can do is buy up these small hospitals in rural America, and then they just close them, right, and make a profit by turning them by selling them for parts.
Yeah.
And same thing with big agriculture, right? So big agriculture also has created systems whereby people they're like 1 degree removed from being sharecroppers, because
Right.
they've promised. Yeah, what you have to do now is, like, if Cargill comes to town and you want to buy their seed, you have to promise to give them a certain percentage of your crop, which is, right? That's how, in Reconstruction, that's how the old plantation owners kept their former slaves working for them, was by saying, like, okay, like, go ahead, like, you can work this land, but you have to give us the crop. So there's no a way to accrue wealth, and we now know that wealth, it's not about income, it's about wealth. It's the larger kinds of things that you own, and that give you, the 60% of Americans who don't have $400 in the bank for an emergency.
Wow.
They don't have income, and they don't have wealth. They don't have anything to fall back on in a crisis, right? So big pharma, big ag, right, big finance, all of those things have proliferated in the years since the Reagan and Clinton administrations.
Wow.
And they have made life very, very difficult for rural people. So that's what I liked about this book. This book said, this is the outcome, this is the inevitable outcome of unfettered capitalism.
And that's just basically capitalism left unchecked, creating monopolies.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And deregulation, right? So there's a lot of rural communities now that are having to deal with the fracking thing, where they're basically becoming just energy resource, and also potential like super funds for the environmental destruction. So yeah, yes.
I thought Theodore Roosevelt, the guy with the small glasses, that was
that guy.
controversial. Yeah, him.
The Mount Rushmore guy.
Yeah, I thought he bust the monopolies a long time ago. Are you saying
Right.
that Reagan went and
Right. Yeah.
re-regulated them?
Yeah. So Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota. Do you remember
Oh, wow.
she ran for, in 2020? She was one of the primary contestants for the Democratic National to be president of the United States. So Biden beat her, but she was one of the last people standing. She just wrote a long book about the history of the regulation of monopolies. I'm not reading it. I can't do it. I can't read 500 pages on monopolies. But yes, if you go back, and this is to your point earlier about how did rural people sort of switch sides. So rural people in the 1890s and through the Roosevelt administration, right? And at that time, some of them were like third-party people, and some of them were part of the Republican Party. They worked really hard through the populist movement and other movements, through the farmers' union movement, to try to control big agriculture and corporate farming, and also monopolies, right? The railroads. Actually, all of it started with attempts to control the railroads. Because if you're a farmer and your crop goes to market on a railroad, and there's only one railroad in town, which usually is the case, they can charge you anything, right?
Yeah.
They can charge you anything. So anyway, there was attempts to regulate. That whole period of time sees an attempt to regulate the railroads, regulate the grain industry, ban corporations from buying farms, right? Create all kinds of protections, like it's like a baby New Deal, right? Trying to use the government to protect small landowners. But in the Reagan era, basically a lot of those programs were canceled. The legislation ran out; it wasn't renewed, and then we had the recession of 2008.
Yeah.
And that was our last chance to put some of those protections, some of those guardrails around capitalism, but we didn't do it.
Wow. Because I know that farming went from, I remember like in early 1900s, it was like 90% farmers, and now we're at
Yes.
2%.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
The landscape is changing due to
Oh, yeah.
technology and big
Yeah.
corporations.
Yeah. And I mean, you know what? If you were one of those 2%, you would really feel left behind
Yeah.
and furious because your identity is tied up with how important you are to the soul of America, right? That's what, why do all the candidates go to the Iowa State Fair? I mean, I guess it's because they have the first in the nation primary or caucus thing. But also, they want to be seen as rubbing elbows with real people. Again, like all tied up with whiteness and the performance of whiteness and morality and religion and all that stuff. But yeah, the 2% of people who are actually farming their own land, and the land is, agricultural. It's not like now there are all these like tourist farms where you can go pretend to be a farmer. Like, no, real farmers is like 2%.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And what is the conservatives promising? Like, what are they promising to these rural people that would make them want to
Vote against their economic interest.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, what's going on? Like,
That's it. All right. And this has been the question that, historians and sociologists have been asking for 20 years. Like,
Yeah.
there's a famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas, that asks that exact same question. Like, why are rural people voting for Republicans when the Republicans don't care to help them, to actually help them? And they're going to give tax breaks to the same corporations that are going to make their lives more difficult. So, because what the Republicans have done in the past half century is they've married together this unfettered capitalism stuff with all the language of morality and religion, and you're the most important people, and I'm not gonna ignore you. I'm not gonna just visit big cities. I mean, Trump went to Fargo twice and Sioux Falls and Sioux City, all during his 2020 presidency. He went back to those places to show them that he hadn't forgotten about them.
Yeah.
Right? Oh no, he also did 4th of July with Governor Nome at Mount Rushmore. And she gave him like a 4-foot high statue of Mount Rushmore with his face on it. And so, because she was already trying to become his vice president at that time. So, but she then published her memoir about the dog, and never mind. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's, if what you care about is being honored, that the Republicans have done a pretty good job about that. Meanwhile, like their plans for the economy don't help rural people at all, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I like how you saying that the Republicans are tying their values, but the morality of their values to their other economic and policies.
Yeah.
To then market their platform so that they could get them for them. Do you feel like, because you mentioned that the urban politics are spreading. You do agree that the urban politics are spreading?
Yes.
Around. Do you feel like with urban politics spreading, do you feel like the biblical values of these rural individuals are being impeded on?
Well, they definitely think so.
Yes.
For sure. Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. There's, I mean, again, like, we make a big mistake not taking these points of view really seriously. Okay, so for a lot of evangelical voters, and some of them are in rural places and some of them are in more suburban places, right? Abortion is plain old wrong. Same-sex marriage, plain old wrong, right? Transgender, anything, plain old wrong. And that's at the core of their belief system. And I also have come to understand one other element of a lot of evangelicalism in that region, which is something, I think it's called something like the doctrine of wealth, which basically says that, right? I mean, my reading of Christianity is like, the poorest go first, right? That blessed are the poor, right? And that it's right. That's my reading. So I never understood why Donald Trump's wealth was one of his selling points in rural America.
Yeah.
Until I read about this doctrine of wealth, which basically suggests that if a person is wealthy, if they have accumulated wealth on earth, that means that God has blessed them and they must be good people. Right? So it's like it's the reverse of thinking blessed are the poor. It's blessed are the wealthy because God has blessed all of these riches upon them.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not, again, like I spent a lot of time saying that's not what I think, but I can understand that. Now understanding that framework, I can understand better why rural white people would support Donald Trump, right, and support his, and look past his indiscretions.
Yeah. Now, I mean, when I look back, I'm a world history teacher.
Yep.
So I kind of look at civilization and countries and nations from a zoom out perspective.
Yeah.
Because I look at trends, I look at themes, and one of the trends and themes that reoccurs throughout history is that the government makes decisions, and they're sometimes the consequences are unattended based off those decisions. So it kind of goes back to what your point is with the New Deal and how it separated two individuals in the same area. They didn't have no intentions of separating those two individuals in the same area, but the decision had unintended consequences to it. Do you feel like the unintended consequences of neglecting the rural America will lead to a civil war, where these two are like, it's very, because they're very strong on their stance, which similar to America. I mean, I wasn't there in 1861, right? But I know that the Civil War did not start in 1861. It started for a procession of years after the Missouri Compromise.
Yeah.
So do you feel that? I wouldn't say feel, but do you see that same echo or see that same theme popping up?
Well, I'll tell you, I would have answered that question differently before the assassination attempt. And I just think that now I know that the shooter was not, he was targeting Trump, but he didn't care if it was like convenient for him that Trump happened to be there because he had searched where Biden was going to be. He searched where Merrick Garland was going to be.
Wow.
But the problem we have with guns in America, I think, might be one of the most fundamentally dangerous things that we have going on. And I also understand why. First of all, there's also really good historical contextualization of the Second Amendment. Right? Yeah. There's really good work that says that the Second Amendment exists in part so that frontiersmen could shoot Native people if they thought they were uprising, and slave owners could shoot runaway slaves. Okay, that's what we've inherited. If that's what we've inherited, right? We need to really think whether that still what we want that amendment to mean. And now guns themselves have been have become icons in rural America of political belief, right? And we know all those deaths of despair, so many of them involve guns in one way or another.
Yeah.
So I do feel like I don't think we'd have the kind of civil war that we had in 1861, but we have something like it already, right? Where we have 75% of domestic terrorism is perpetrated by young white men on the right. This particular guy is a young white man who didn't apparently have a political affiliation, but he certainly lived in a community where there were, and in a household where there were AR-15s pretty much everywhere. Yeah, so I don't, like, the gun violence stuff it's the most significant issue of our time. And it's completely related to the politics that we've been talking about.
Wow. And you don't see any change occurring?
You know, I was one of those people who thought, well, after the Newtown, especially since I'm from Connecticut, after the Newtown shooting, there would definitely be a change. Or after Dylan Roof went into the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, there would definitely be a change. And once basically the NRA got like practically bankrupted 2 years ago, and I thought, okay, maybe there's going to be a change. Or maybe there's going to be a change now that we've had someone actually try to kill a presidential candidate.
Yeah.
There were changes. You know, there was a assault weapons ban that was passed after Ronald Reagan was almost killed, called the Brady Bill, and because his, I want to say press secretary, but I could be totally wrong about that, was very, very, very badly injured. And there was an assault weapons ban for a while. People forget, like, it wasn't very long ago. There was an assault weapons ban. Wow. But I think it was time limited, and then it wasn't a Republican dominated Congress or Senate didn't vote it back. So now we don't have it again. So I think that this is something that we really all of us have to keep trying to find middle ground on, even if the middle ground seems really basic, like background checks. You know, closing the loophole for domestic violence. You know, you have to start, you know, around the edges of something that's such an important issue. And then I think people in rural America have to figure this out for themselves too. Like, there are too many suicides. And too much really easy access to guns for children. Yeah. You know, I would hope that there are activists in those communities that are trying to change things. Yeah.
You gotta start. It starts with an idea. Somebody gotta think about an idea to kind of like slow down that gun toting over there.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, I know. There's people over there that got like 150 guns. And like, 150 guns.
Yeah. I know.
I would understand 1 million ammo, but you got like different variety of guns. Like, I'm like, 150 is crazy. But you had a quote that I saw that I really like, and I'm gonna paraphrase the quote. It says, if we don't study the root of the issue, and you list a bunch of things that have occurred, because you're saying that these are not new phenomena.
Right.
One, I want to know why did you say they're not new phenomena? And then you also mentioned that today's history might be tomorrow's tragedy. What event in American history will we see affect the present or the future?
Shoot, I thought you were going to ask me the question about what thing in the past I wanted to know.
You could answer both of them.
Yeah. I don't. First of all, I'm like I understand that this is what happens with every new president, and they get the CIA briefing. Every new president, Obama, Trump, everybody says, "Okay, so what really happened with the JFK assassination?" That's what I want to know. All right,
I want to know about that too.
Everybody wants to know. All right, so but that's a topic for a different day. Okay, so restate the question that you actually asked me.
I was gonna ask. Well, first of all, what do you want to study from the root of the past
Right.
that you say that is not a new phenomenon?
Right. All right. So I think I wrote that in Rural Radicals
Yeah.
because at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, which is when I wrote the book,
Wow.
I people were like, first of all, when Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City bombing, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, everyone immediately thought it was Muslim terrorists, right? And then they were like shocked, like, oh, wait, what? Like, who's this guy? And like,
White
what?
man.
Yeah, like what? Right? Okay. And so I knew just from teaching and reading that there had been a lot of throughout throughout U.S. history, a lot of um, radical actions taken against the government, right?
Yeah.
Some of them violent, some of them more like this everyday resistance that you and I talked about, where people
Yeah.
found workarounds when the federal government, it's sort of like, you know, we might all do that from time to time with our taxes. That's a kind of everyday. Maybe not report every little tiny thing. Not me, of course. I'm not saying,
Well,
but
no, no. I
yeah,
pay all my taxes.
none of us. All right. So anyway, okay. So I wrote this book that starts with Shays' Rebellion
Yeah.
in 1676, and then walks the reader through all of these different anti-government groups, ending with the radical militia types in the 1990s, which have only grown more and more. And one of the interesting things I talk about is the fact that some of these anti-government actions could be considered like more like ideas that are more fully associated with the left, and other and like some rural version of Occupy Wall Street, right? We see some of that in the 1930s, where there are white rural men who find a judge who's about to and lynch a judge. They lynch a judge who's about to foreclose on farm properties, right? So, okay, you might think that's kind of like anti-corporate, right? Anti-legal. That's more
Yeah.
left-leaning, but these days we associate this violence more with right-leaning groups for all the reasons that flip-flop has happened that we've talked about. But I wrote the book because I just felt like people just saying like, wait, what's this? Like, where did this come from? It's. I don't want to say there's never anything new on the face of the earth, but there's always a broader historical context that we can understand things better
Yeah.
in, right? And right now I'm particularly again interested in the use of guns for political and other kinds of violence, and what we can learn by looking at the past in that way. And also a secondary thing that I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
I've been interested for a long time in the ways in which women in power are often met with a lot more resistance in the political sphere or the corporate sphere, right? And that resistance is the resistance to women in power takes different forms than resistance to men in power, or men who want to be in power, or men seeking power or running for office or trying to climb the ladder of a school or a corporate. And again, this gets back to the beginning of our conversation. My interest in that goes back to my mom's experience becoming the head of this school when there were only 2 other women in the country who had jobs like that, and the ways in which, like, people just lost their minds and assumed that she couldn't do it. So that is a historical story that I'm interested in telling. We are going to nominate, the Democrats are going to nominate another woman, and this time a black woman, for president. And whether it just follows the same playbook that we've seen so many times in the past, or whether there's something new, is really going to be interesting to me.
Yeah, it's gonna be a whole different dynamic because
It is.
Kamala is crossing a lot of intersectionality.
She is.
Yeah,
Yeah, she is.
in a very unique place too.
Yep, yes. and you know, I just hope for her and pray for her that it doesn't get ugly and especially not dangerous.
Yeah.
You know?
Which is a very strong possibility. The amount of volatility
Yeah.
on both sides. I don't think it's only
Right.
the Republican side that's radical in their position. I think the
Right.
Democratic side is also radical.
Yes, that's true too. That's true. I learned a new word today. You are probably familiar with from one of my colleagues at the college called, and I'm not even sure how to say it, misogynoir. Do you know this word? So it
No.
has, yeah. So it's a combination of misogyny and the word noir, which is the French word for dark or black,
Yeah.
right? So it's the hatred of black. It's a word for the hatred of black women, misogynoir. And yeah, so I'm going to try to learn more about that, and so that I'm a better informed viewer and teacher, because I'm teaching another political history course in the fall.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you now before I ask the next question, do you see a similarity between John Brown, Oklahoma, the bombing in Oklahoma, because they're all passionate actions against the government.
Yeah, yeah. I think John Brown's in that book, Rural Radicals, unless he wasn't a rural person. But yeah, I mean, we live in a society with a very violent past. Now, that doesn't mean that there haven't been other assassinations in other countries and other bombings and Guy Fawkes Day and all that.
Yeah.
But yes, I would put John Brown and the Oklahoma City bomber in the same category of white men using violence against the government for different reasons in different circumstances. But even so, yes, I would.
Okay. Now, Now, these are the last two questions. I appreciate you for pulling up on me. Now, any issue from the past, do you feel like, yeah, we know that it's affecting the present, but do you see it affecting anything in the future? Do you, like, I need you to be a prophet right now. Like, based on...
historians are good at that.
Yes.
All right, so...
The book of stock right now. Like,
all right, yeah, so what's going on with our immigration system will have repercussions in the future, right? Okay, so this stuff is deep and complex and people disagree. But we know that immigration has, well, I agree with those people who say that immigration has a positive impact on the economy, on a capitalist economy, because a capitalist economy requires people to work at the lowest levels of labor for the least amount of money. Now, okay, so that's basically like me saying immigration is great because then we can exploit more people. So, I mean, that's not good. That's not cool either. That's not good. But it is true that immigration reform, whatever immigration reform we may or may not see in the future, will change who we are going forward forever. The way I teach it is the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 was the fourth of the Civil Rights Acts, because it took away all the racial quotas that had been in place before that, and it allowed the most diverse group of people to come to the United States ever in our history from all over the world: Africa, Asia, South America, everywhere, Russia, Eastern Europe, etc. And our society reflects that now. Now, some people think that's bad. And the story of the Immigration Act of 1965 is fascinating because Lyndon Johnson said, "Oh, look, the way this is written, you don't have to worry about it. It's not going to change our society." And nothing has changed our society more. Like, they were like, and it's a long story why, but they thought it wasn't going to change society, but it changed society, and we're right now just talking about legal immigrants, just documented people coming in under the U.S. programs, have completely changed American society.
Yeah.
And a great article in the New York Times, for example, about how South Asians have become one of the most important political groups in the last 2 or 3 years. And if you think about, right, that J.D. Vance is married to a South Asian and Kamala Harris is half South Asian, right? So, well, when did South Asians start coming here? Because the Supreme Court declared that they weren't even allowed to come to the United States in 1923. Well, they started coming after 1965. And make, like, and that's just one example, right, of people who've made a huge difference to who we are, how we live together, small things from like what we eat, right, to the religions that we practice. So if anything was going to have ramifications in the future about who is American, like what we care about, how we live together, what we believe, it's going to be based in these new issues around immigration. Yeah.
And I could also see how immigration could push out poor whites because they're not trying to work for a low class job.
Well, right. So you have when capitalism is working well, and this was true. Well, there's really interesting stuff in the historical literature about the impact of immigration on the economy and where whites fit in to that. So one of the books that I think is the most important is called When the Irish Became White. Okay, so that just the title is like what? Mm-hmm. Like Irish people are white, right? but Irish people were not considered white people when they first came to the United States because they were Catholic. And they were housed in segregated neighborhoods with freed African Americans, right? That's, side note, development of tap as a dance form comes from the cultural interactions of Irish dance and the kinds of dances that slaves did. So that's right. So we see, like, we have this thing that we call all American that is actually from this really fruitful. Okay, but I think the Irish in just before the Civil War, and including the New York draft riots, Irish came to understand that the way you advanced into whiteness in the United States was by making sure that everybody knew you weren't black, that blacks weren't going to be in your unions, that you weren't going to live in their neighborhoods, you weren't going to intermarry with them, right? So racism elevated white people throughout. Racism elevates white people, right?
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it's for. That's what it's made for.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Wow. So, last question.
Yeah, good.
I appreciate you for spending so much time with me.
I appreciate it.
I hope this conversation has been going very well. The last question is, what lessons do you take from history that you apply to your life today?
You know, this is one of those big ones. It's not from a historic. It's going back to like my imagination, right? Like we all.
This goes back to philosophy.
We all like have struggles, right? Like I was telling you, I'm just struggling and helping my mom with the aging process, and thinking historically always helps me because I think about, right, there have always been people who've been aging, and there have always been families that have to, and there's always been religions that help us understand death and dying and aging and what's right and wrong about that, and all of the pain that people can inflict upon each other. It's all those things are inescapable conditions of humanity. And then somebody has a brand new baby. And people don't ever stop hoping for the future, because that's what that baby, planned or unplanned or wanted or unwanted, that's what that baby is. The baby is the future. And you know, you bring the baby into the world and you think, wow, like I remember, this is kind of crazy, okay? But when my daughter had her first daughter, They also had a wonderful dog. They still have this wonderful dog. And I thought, oh, she's going to lose this dog. She's going to be 10 years old and lose her dog. And I was like, yeah, she is. Because she's this beautiful, wonderful creature that blesses the world by her presence. And that doesn't mean she gets easy street. Right? Because none of us do.
So it goes back to a Mark Twain quote that says that the world was here first. It doesn't owe you understanding.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it goes back to that concept that like we all got this path that we have to go through, and it's gonna involve life and death, and that's part of the process of life.
Yeah. And it's
So
always been true for everyone.
For everybody.
Yeah.
And I love the interconnectedness of that.
Yeah.
Like Martin Luther King says, an injustice somewhere is an injustice here.
Yeah.
So all these things are like connected
Yeah.
into this weird cesspool that we call Earth.
Yep.
And all these outcomes come out of it. I appreciate you.
Oh, I appreciate you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
for allowing me into your mind. And thank you for giving your time. I'm gonna clap it up one last time.
Thank you. I want to hear it.
Enjoy your day,
Thank you.
and God bless.
Bye-bye.